everyone, and welcome to our series in conversation, Afrocentric Approaches to Teaching History. We'll begin with a land acknowledgement to show our gratitude to the first peoples who managed these lands according to their traditional customs. Let us keep this land acknowledgement in mind as we engage in tonight's conversation. We take this time to recognize that we are currently on the traditional territory shared between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, and the Haudenosaunee people. OISE, the University of Toronto, stands on the land signed as a Treaty 13 and is protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement, which is a treaty of overlapping governance between the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit River that bind them to share these sacred territories and to protect the land. Wampum belts are sacred physical and symbolic representations that affirm philosophical principles and enshrine political agreements and laws, validating relations and treaties, narrating significant events, and recalling oral traditions. The Dish with One Spoon Wampum uses the symbolism of a dish to represent the territories, and the one spoon illustrating that we are all to share the resources of the land and only take what we need to maintain balance and reciprocal relations. Since time immemorial, Turtle Island's first peoples have continued to walk gently on land, offering their assistance to settlers and sharing their knowledges and ways of knowing. Turtle Island is allowed many peoples, including colonial settlers, to be within this space. Canadians must also acknowledge the presence of Black and Africans in the diasporas. Their complicated histories and disrupted relations shape stories intertwined with ours connected to the land. Stories of ruptured relationships and hope guided by the birds who return to lead us to a sacred destiny of liberation. A land acknowledgement is only meaningful if we learn from history and the long journeys and struggles that have brought all of us together. We must learn how to practice reconciliation in everyday lives within ourselves, our families, communities, governments, places of worship, school, and workplaces. Nai wen, Chimegwech, merci advance, thank you, asante sana. I have the honor of introducing our moderator for this evening, Fiona Lloyd-Henry. Fiona Henry is the coordinating principal for system transformation and capacity building at PDSB. She has been a classroom teacher, department head, and has served as the instructional resource teacher and instructional coordinator for equity and inclusive education. Fiona is dedicated to serving students and creating educational environments that are equitable, inclusive, and free from discriminatory practices. She's interested in critical, democratic pedagogy and anti-oppressive forms of teaching and learning. She values positive forms of teaching and learning and positive partnerships with families and caregivers. She also values the development of student efficacy and social activism. In addition to her formal work as an educator, Fiona serves on the board of local not-for-profit organizations that advocate for Black children. Fiona believes in the transformative power of education, of its ability to create successful, critically aware citizens that are dedicated to justice and peace. Fiona, the evening is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. It is my pleasure to work with my panelists today, Tyler and Claudette and Rosemary, to talk about Afrocentricity in history teaching. Before we get much underway, I'd just like to point out some logistics for our audience. So if you're tweeting, please use the hashtag CIARS in Convo. Please submit your questions in advance. The question and answer box is at the bottom of the screen. Please let us know to whom you're directing each question. And so that we can direct it to the panelists you'd like to have answer that question. The presentation is being live streamed on Facebook and YouTube and is being recorded. The recording will be made available to each person who signed up. Let us take some time to welcome our panelists. We'll start with Tyler. Tyler Robinson, he, him, is a father, a community member, educator, and a proud Scarbarian. An homage to Scarborough, the culturally diverse northeast quadrant of Toronto. In education, Tyler gravitates towards students who are underserved by systemic education. That is, all students. He's interested in ways that the classroom can be used as a space for true cross-cultural and intersectional solidarity, and as a space for healing, liberation, and community building. In Tyler's most recent work, he led a team of all Black educators in the creation of an interdisciplinary anti-Black racism course, its resulting public and media responses to overt and covert racism, and the course's subsequent mobilization across the province, building off community partnerships. This process culminated with an effort to seek provincial office so as to bring meaningful reform to education. Tyler studied commerce at X University, worked a few years on Bay Street where he implemented and oversaw his organization CSR Youth Mentoring Program, and then returned to York University to pursue a career in education. Welcome, welcome, Tyler.
So nice to be here. Thank you, Fiona.
We also have with us Claudette Rutherford. She's a mother of 3, an educator of 20 years, and a department head of social science and humanities. She's currently on secondment. Claudette is an education research and evaluation lead for parents of Black children. Shout out. Claudette previously served as Director of Youth and Education Programs for the Markham African Caribbean Canadian Association and sits on the OACAS Education Outcome Strategy Committee. Claudette runs her own private consulting firm, developing curriculum resources and offering organizational change management strategies from an anti-oppression lens. She serves on several municipal and regional steering committees championing race equity and is an op-ed contributor for the Center for Integrative Anti-Racism Studies. Welcome, Claudette.
Thanks, Fiona. Glad to be here. Thank you so much. Can't wait to get started.
Me too. Rosemary Sadlier, Order of Canada, is a social justice advocate, a researcher, a writer, a consultant, and international speaker on Black history, anti-racism, and women's issues. She was a past president of the Ontario Black History Society and was the driving force of the secured commemoration of February as Black History Month at all levels of the government. She secured August 1st as Emancipation Day municipally in 1995 and provincially in 2008 with a national declaration recently passed now, making this a national commemoration in Canada. She saw to the creation of the National Day for the Honorable Lincoln Alexander. She has given deputations to the UN, Rapporteur on Race Relations, the federal and provincial governments, and provided consultative work for the Royal Ontario Museum, the CMHR, the Ward Heritage Interpretive Group, the Binational Study of the Underground Railroad, and heritage conferences. Sadlier has developed or contributed to the African Canadian curriculum, national exhibits, and publications. She was an appointed member of the College of Early Childhood Educators and currently serves on the Registrations Appeals Committee of the Ontario College of Teachers. She has written 7 books on African Canadian history, affects diversity, equity, and inclusion projects, and recently was appointed Equality Lead for the Americas and the Caribbean with the Royal Commonwealth Society, and she serves on the Rogers Group of Funds. Sadlier is dedicated to social justice and using the frame of Black history, seeks to educate and empower others. Welcome tonight, Rosemary.
Thank you so much for that very generous introduction. And before anyone out there reacts, let me just say that I have the Order of Ontario, not the Order of Canada. So there you go.
And we will say that that is very short-sighted of Canada. They ought to get on board.
Thank you very much for having me here, and I look forward to the discussion.
Absolutely. Molefi Asante describes Afrocentricity, Afrocentricity as a frame of reference wherein phenomena are viewed from the perspective of the African person. The Afrocentric approach seeks in every situation the appropriate centrality of the African person. In education, this means that the teachers provide students the opportunity to study the world and its people, concepts, and history from an African worldview. Happy Black History Month. In 1933, Carter G. Woodson, whose scholarship and dedication to the celebration of Black history, culture, and experiences led to the establishment of Black History Month, published his book, The Miseducation of the Negro. Quoting from his book, from Woodson's book, Dr. Asante notes that as a result of being educated away from their own cultures and experiences and traditions, being attached to the fringes of the European cultures and taught to valorize European culture to the detriment of their own, African or Black peoples are often dislocated from themselves and face the risk of their psychological and cultural deaths when belying the realities of and I've used the broader term North American to include Canada, that North American life, they presume that they hold the same position as European North Americans. I'm excited this evening to moderate this conversation and with our panels to talk about adopting an Afrocentric approach to the teaching of history. I am thrilled to be joined by my panel, by the panelists, Tyler, Claudette, and Rosemary, all giants in their imaginations, in their work, and in their commitment, to talk about teaching history through an anti-racist and anti-colonial framework, one that allows us to raise critical questions, to challenge the absences and the omissions, the negations, denials, and devaluations of African and Black lives, to interrogate and subvert racist historical narratives, and address how we can leverage community-centered knowledges in the teaching of history. We'll also address ways of presenting African history as part of a search for new educational futures in the current global climate of anti-Black racisms and anti-Blackness, placing African Black experiences at the center of analysis and as a prism to understand global events, including the interrogation of colonial historical narratives. To borrow an African proverb, there's nothing that does not have a beginning. With that said, we are going to move into our conversation. The cultural contributions of African people to global history and human civilization are incalculable. Africans and Afro-descendant people have shaped cultures and transformed communities through political force and resistance, through the arts, science, technology, and beyond. Yet in Canadian classrooms, students rarely learn about the richness, the complexity, the diversity, excellence, and brilliance of Black peoples beyond the transatlantic slave trade and the civil rights movement. Our stories do not begin or end in 1492. The first question, and we're going to pose this question to each of the panelists. Considering the Eurocentric hold on knowledge production and dissemination, how do we decolonize the historical canon and teacher training programs so that educators are equipped to engage with Afrocentric and multicentric historical approaches before they can engage in anti-colonial education? How does the paucity of Black history resources, of Black history, culture, experiences, contributions, etc., represent deliberate erasure? And how do the racial, cultural, and social relations of power impact the way we write history, historiography, or the way we examine history critically? What are some examples of how some teachers show resistance to racist policies, programs, and curriculum, and how can we support their efforts, or what we can learn, or what can we learn from their work or their resistances. We will start the first question with Rosemary.
Well, I thought you might do that, just from what you said. And I think that part of the reason that the way I want to approach this for myself is to talk about my own experience, both as a student, well, actually as a student in Ontario schools, as a teacher in Ontario schools briefly, and as a teacher in a system, in the formal educational system and outside of it, and as a parent. And I think that it's very important for people to remember that given all that you have offered in this question, this is not the way it has been for all that very long. You're talking about incredibly progressive steps that are incredibly important and which are probably, yes, already taking place in many faculties of education. Know that when I was going to university, when I began my own study of Black history, because there was no Black history offered in the school system, I remember on one occasion going into the Oisey Library, picking up the supposed best possible resource that could be available, written by a historian by the name of JMS Careless. And it was a book that was quite thick. It was quite impressive. And I mention this because it was as if this was the book that had all the answers that would guide us in our learning. And I went to the back of the book, went to the index, looking for the places where I could possibly find some mention of Black people, African people, something. And in a book that was this thick, with a few indications of Blackness in the book, there were two sentences, which essentially said they came to Canada and then they went back. So the next, I mention this because this was guiding people who were attending University of Toronto and Oisey and faculties of education at that point in time. Moving ahead, I became a teacher after my efforts to get into my chosen profession were unsuccessful. I was quite amazed that during my year of teacher training, I was to bring Black history that I had accrued on my own, not in the Faculty of Education, not in my undergraduate or my graduate degree, to my colleagues. I knew this was coming up. I prepared for it. I was very excited to be able to share this information with them because I felt it would be helpful to our kids and helpful to the broader community. For many different reasons, my presentation date was changed. It suddenly became moved later and later and later, until finally it was to take place on what was the last day of the year. My 1 hour presentation had now been reduced to 10 minutes. And in that 10 minutes, that was not going to be graded because it was on the last day of the program, I was equipping the next generation of teacher trainees to enter into a multicultural classroom. So I mention that because it was incredibly systemic. It was incredibly challenging. It made it incredibly impossible to share what information I had, and certainly it wasn't being reflected around me. I think the other part of that is that I continue to be hopeful, and I continue to feel that my children were going to have a better experience, that somehow magically, despite that reality, because I did my teacher training a bit after I had my master's degree, and I already had two children, I really wanted to believe that we were post-racial. I wanted to believe it because we were having grand conversations. But the reality was my children were reflecting back to me the same experiences, the same challenges they were having with the lack of representation and inclusion in the classroom and thereabouts. And in fact, coming back with racist depictions of Africans in materials. And this was both in the main regular English program as well as the French immersion program. Our history has not been erased. I think that that's a misnomer and incredibly misleading. Our history was never gathered. Our history was never acknowledged as being important. Our history was never affirmed. Our history was never affirmed for us to be feeling affirmed about it. Our stories were not kept by us because we were socialized to believe that our stories were not as important as other stories. And in some cases, materials that are irreplaceable have been lost forever because the cultural institutions that existed, to preserve and collect and honor them would not accept or did not reach out or did not express an interest in having them. So they weren't erased. They were systemically ignored. So what are some examples of how teachers are showing their resistance? Is that where I'm supposed to go? I'm sort of going on here, but too long. What I would say is that in terms of what I have seen, there are teachers in classrooms and there are teachers outside of classrooms. My own introduction to Black history took place outside of a classroom in high school. That was the beginning of it, with university students who went into the community and were willing to share their knowledge, introduce us to materials that they were picking up, not necessarily at university, but at Black bookstores, and bringing into us for discussions. So that was a type of teaching that I think we cannot overlook. But I think that in formal classrooms, we also have educators who feel a comfort, who feel a necessity, who understand the value of an Afrocentric perspective or a social justice perspective, or having a more inclusionary approach to education that will take the risk no matter what administration might be guiding them or dissuading them from doing, and introduce materials to their students that are incredibly important. Take their students on field trips, introduce their students to film and arts, the whole gamut that helps to reflect and represent them, because they know that their students, in order to be better students, need to be affirmed. And then in terms of me as the person who headed the only provincial heritage organization in this country without payment for over 22 years. And I say that not because I didn't need the money, but because it wasn't possible given the structure of that nonprofit organization. I shared what I could with the resources that were possible to sustain and enable that to happen. And when you think about the pressure to tell all of the stories, not just the Black history story, but the Black arts story, the Black sports story, the Black everything story, the Black health story, with very little funding from, at the time, we only were funded in part by the province of Ontario, and our funds were cut by 90%. You can just see the challenges that were there. So already systemically denied and underprivileged, and then attempting to tell a story through an institution that was significantly underfunded and without generational supports and wealth and volunteers. So I think that it's up to, in part, the will and determination of people to do the right thing. And not everybody is prepared to take those risks if they're in a school where they feel administration will prevent them from doing certain things, or that their jobs may be in jeopardy. I know that going into many public schools to do Black history presentations, I did thousands of them, and I had the opportunity to be in many different schools. I was horrified to walk into certain schools, some of which I still remember quite vividly, to be pulled aside by ashen educators concerned that I might offer up some comment that would be contrary to the overarching narrative in their school. So it really takes a lot of resistance on the part of the educator. It takes a level of empowerment and interest on the part of the parent, who cannot assume that the school is going to do it for them. And it takes administration as well, who are willing to see these things happen, whether they currently exist as expectations for a grade or not. I think that we have to do it anyway, because our kids have been suffering and will continue to suffer if we don't.
Thank you so much for your fulsome answer, Rosemary. You've mentioned quite a few really key points here that I'm sure will remain a thread throughout the work we do. The extent to which educators are supported in doing Black history, both by the structures in their schools, by the curriculum, the written curriculum, and how much I think Black teachers have taken on themselves, for example, whether it's buying resources at bookstores and sharing those, bringing students on trips, having Black folks come into schools. Those are just some of the things that teachers do. I'm happy for where some of that has, some of your responses have gone. And I'm excited, for example, to bring Tyler in, because his recent course on anti-Black racism, I think would, him talking about that might be a really good segue. Would you like me to repeat any part of the question, Tyler?
I'm good with it. If the audience needs it, feel free. Your choice. You lead me, please.
I won't read the whole thing, but maybe some of the themes. How do we decolonize the historical canon and teacher training programs? How does the paucity of Black history reflect a sort of erasure, a deliberate erasure? Why are we not doing more of it? How do the social relations of power determine what we write about history, whose histories we study and exalt, and whose we denigrate? And how do teachers show resistance, and how can we support them?
Yeah, thank you for that. And just, what an honor it is to sit and listen to Rosemary speak about the work that was done so many years ago, because you'll see in the response that I've prepared, it's almost like she set up or she paved the pathway in order for us to continue in this work. So I'm going to try to touch on a few things that she spoke on. But first I'll say that's a great question, and the question kept me up late. So whoever did that, you're responsible for my tiredness today. Happy to be here with you all for certain. I just want to say that I'm joining you from land that falls within the Williams Treaty boundaries under the caretaking of the Mississaugas of Squook First Nation. So, okay, let me try to get into this question. For starters, you can't get to anti-colonial education without decentering Eurocentrism and moving to a multicentric approach, which all the research and anecdotal experience tells us is excellent for reaching diverse classrooms. And of course, you can't get to that multi-centric approach without deep exploration of Afrocentric and Indigenous knowledge systems, for starters. The ongoing colonial project of Canada historically begins with the oppressions of these communities, and so Black liberation and Indigenous sovereignty are tied up together. But to go further, the question speaks of the quote unquote Eurocentric hold on knowledge production and dissemination in our system of education. And I would argue that it's more like a stranglehold. For students and teachers alike, there's little room to breathe in anything beyond that which is deemed normal and worthy from a Eurocentric lens, be it in the classroom, looking at history or otherwise, or at the faculties of education. And Rosemary spoke to the idea that this work at the faculties is relatively new work. And so as I speak to this piece about teacher training, I'm gonna locate myself first. After being denied entrance to OISE, and yes, I hold grudges, I began at York University's Faculty of Ed in 2009. So I can't speak to what changes have occurred since then, nor can I speak to what happens at other institutions, only my own experience while I was there. However, given that I've come to realize how deeply set in their ways our systems and institutions are, I imagine some of the following remains true. And I'd also add that at 39 years of age, I would assume or estimate that about 70% of teachers in schools I've taught at are older than I am. And so while my teacher ed experience may not be up to date, we can expect it to be similar to the experiences of many teachers who are teaching in our systems today, likely even the vast majority. So entering the faculty as a mature student and approaching education as a calling, I deeply enjoyed being in a thoughtful space where it was clear that equity was a theoretical pillar for our course advisors. That mattered to me, and I hadn't seen that before. However, there's also always gaps between theory and practice. Decolonization wasn't spoken of. White supremacy wasn't spoken of. Afrocentric approaches to teaching and learning were not spoken of. And in fact, I was really disappointed to not have a single Black prof as a lecturer or even as a guest lecturer in my entire Bachelor of Education experience. I do recall some brief discussion around the legitimacy of the concept of Afrocentric, of the Afrocentric schools model, namely whether it was a good or bad idea to even exist. But there was no depth to those discussions because there was no Black scholarship that would contain the theoretical foundations for such schools that was being read, that was being discussed, and then being applied. We weren't looking at Gloria Ladson Billings. There was no William Tate. There was no Kimberly Crenshaw, no Audre Lorde, no Malona Karenga, no Bell Hooks, no Goldie Muhammad, no Carl James, who was at York University, and indeed no George Day, an elder who I am grateful toward for creating space for today's discussion and many others like it. Now, I don't want to misrepresent my position. I am not an expert in the body of work of any of these Black scholars. But I mention them because these are the folks that my curriculum writing colleagues and I were fortunate to be able to read, to discuss, to debate, and then to embed in our Deconstructing Anti-Black Racism course, of which I was the project lead, which at last count is now running this year at 43 schools across Ontario, 6 different school boards, which is exponential growth given that we were at one school last year. So let me add, unlike much of today's audience, I did not go on to study for a master's or a PhD where one would hope that this Black scholarship is now commonplace. But also, if Black scholarship is currently not being covered extensively in concurrent and consecutive Bachelor of Ed programs, it needs to be, right? We cannot wait to delve into it when we get to our master's, to doctoral, to postdoctoral programs, because most existing classroom teachers, like myself, have not spent time in these spaces. And in a highly politicized, underfunded, and overstressed sector, teachers are certainly not receiving the contributions of Black scholarship in the very limited professional learning time available to us. Life circumstances did not afford me the privilege to go to grad school. And were it not for a unique set of circumstances culminating with my colleagues and I insisting on having the full support of the PDSB, including being seconded during the school year to work with Karen Murray and Rakia Mohammed and others at the Center of Excellence for Black Student Achievement to review, to redraft the curriculum, we too would not have had access to this learning, you know? So this is complex stuff. When I moved to thinking about the resources and social power relations playing out in schools, I'm reminded that my co-panelist, another elder, and I use this term with great honor, Rosemary Sadler, at one time led the Ontario Black History Society. So in terms of accessing Canadian resources that center Black history, experiences, counter narratives, and the like, during our course, our team's course review and secondment, we had the great honor of working with Natasha Henry, the current head of the Ontario Black History Society. And when we talk about access to resources, Rosemary being the first head and Natasha being there now, they are collective, and Natasha's present guidance was absolutely essential to our work, because to be frank, we felt overwhelmed and lost, right? You have to remember, we came through this system too. I'm sure everyone remembers the Blacked Out History campaign where OBHS ran in 2020, and they showed a grade 8 textbook, and everything that didn't pertain to Black history was blacked out. And the result of the whole thing was that with hundreds of pages of text, 13 pages said anything about Black history. So the erasure, or as Rosemary points out, the ignoring of Black history in Canadian history has been almost complete, right? And I think of that completeness in 3 ways. One, this was my lived experience as a student, right? Scarcely learning anything in school of any substance about my own history, my ancestors, how my father ended up in New Jersey via Virginia, and where in Africa my family was stolen from. And who my family was before imperialism and capitalism and colonialism interrupted the history of my ancestors. Number 2, I know this because while not a history major, I have taught history in our schools, and I have experienced department heads who lack critical consciousness and seemingly any understanding of Afrocentric approaches, who utilize their positional power to dictate what Canadian history is valuable and what will be taught to our young people, right? And then a third way, I know this erasure and ignoring of our history is widespread because I continue to speak to Black youth about their experience. And I chatted to 2 last week in preparation for this talk. One told me that they enrolled in our Deconstructing Anti-Black Racism course because they and their peers often feel embarrassed about how little they know of their history, and consequently, they often have to pretend that they know, and they didn't want to pretend anymore. The other student told me that they often feel like their Blackness is a burden. They know they shouldn't think that way, and yet they do. And this is heartbreaking stuff. So to wrap on a positive note, both students said that the presence of Afrocentric education in their schools and in their lives makes them feel seen and heard, like a weight is being lifted, that change is possible, and that one of them said that I won't just be a diversity hire. And that last comment really struck me, you know, because I felt their pain. I told that kid I was proud of them. I'm not their parent, I'm not their teacher. We had just met, but Afrocentric wisdom tells us that it takes a village to raise a child.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Tyler. And thank you not just for your response, but for the work that you and your team did to get that course together. I still remember the excitement and somebody seeing it first and sending it to us, and then, you know, the sort of sharing and so on. There is a lot of joy to be had in that sort of creative process. And when you see something that you've been waiting for a really long time, then it's that much more exciting. And hopefully we will get to come back around a little bit to talk about some of what you had in that work.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Claudette.
Hi. Yes, well, let's go back to, I can just start by saying thank you for inviting me. I am I'm thrilled. I'm learning a lot. And just to be sitting, I've been with Rosemary and Dee Tyler in other spaces, but to be here with them today, just I feel inspired, further inspired and honored, really. So thank you. And also need to shout out our OISD faculty who was just online prior for just really nurturing all of us, right? And continuing, you know, our journey of self-discovery and what we want to bring to the world. So I think about, when I look back at the question, I'm thinking about where the educational journey begins, right? Where it starts and where it ends, and if it ends. But I think about the need for the pedagogical shift in how we see Black existence, how we see Black prosperity, and how, you know, as a society, we value that. So from the earliest childhood education space, and I thinking about daycare, right? Your daycare classroom, through K to 12, through the teacher candidacy classrooms, any higher education classrooms, through to boardrooms. We are learning all the time. And so in the current status quo, what's really communicated, and this is my view, is that Black humanity is not deemed as important, right? The general populace does not see the inherent value of increasing Black vitality, and don't see the inherent value of Black life, like in and of itself, outside of the relationship that Black life has to, you know, in terms of benefit to the dominant culture. And so that is where I kind of position, that's where my thinking about, you know, what needs to change, that's what needs to change. Because we see it in how our children are surveilled, but not protected in schools. We see how our children become invisible in classrooms, and they talk about it. And Tyler just mentioned that as well. And we see it in, and I use the word erasure, Rosemary, I completely, I hear you. I hear what you're saying, that those stories are there. And I want to build on that and talk a bit about it more. But there is a deliberate attempt to erase Black and African epistemologies, livelihoods, culture, in school curriculum, and everywhere else in between. And so when I think about, you know, why did I want to be a teacher? Why did I want to, why do I want to do this work in community? It's really to endeavor towards this emancipatory learning experience for our children. And I want to encourage us all, I don't know how many educators are here, but I want to take a minute to talk to educators. If I can, just as a colleague, let's collectively examine whose standards we use to illustrate humanity, right? And as an educator, and we're caregivers, we're educators, but we're caregivers. And what permissions are we seeking in determining what our children learn in classes, how we enhance and augment the ancestral knowledge and the gifts that children are already bringing to us from home, right? Because I'm thinking about this anti-colonial system that we want to create. And within that, the learning and curriculum is co-created. And a lot of that, I know Dee Tyler incorporated so much of that, embedded that into the work that you and your colleagues did. Learning and the curriculum, all of that should be co-created in consultation with community and based in Indigenous learning systems, investing in parents and community, because we know that parents and communities have rich vessels of knowledge. So as educators, our job is to teach the children, of course, but also, you know, the children belong to the community, and there's crucial learning that's already happening there. And so how are we helping to honor that? How are we helping to sustain that as an ecosystem? You know, so, you know, when we talk about the pedagogical shift, that's what I feel. And when I think about creating, you know, or what do I imagine, those are my imaginings. Curriculum, we know, should reflect the learner's lived experiences. And the learning outcomes can be co-determined, right, by all of the learners in the classroom, adults and children. And we should all see ourselves as learners as well. I know there was a question, or the question was around resistance, I think. And I guess I've always been one of those resistors. But I think about some educators that may feel a resistance towards doing this work about incorporating African cultures. And some feel they don't need to do so because, quote unquote, they don't teach Black students. And I always think about, we teach about a lot of things. I always say, the solar system, for example, we teach about the solar system. And I don't know how many children are going into the solar system or going into outer space, for example. Not that I'm relegating that as not possible, but what I'm saying is that we don't know that they would go into outer space, but we teach them about it anyway. But what we do know for sure is that every student, every young person we teach is going to meet a Black person and will need to value their lives. And so it is important to teach about Afrocentrism. It is important to teach about Black people, descendants of Africa. And sometimes I know we hear, I don't want to get it wrong. I don't think I know enough, but we're all kind of dealing with the same thing. I didn't necessarily know everything that there was to know. And if you teach 100 Black children or no Black children, all learning, and all learners should be learning about Indigenous Africans, about Black Canadian experiences. And I know sometimes there is what I notice is that there's a lot more, people are far more willing to talk about the Black Canadian experience. Sorry, my son's calling. Black Canadian experience, and far less likely to talk about people in Africa, on the continent, of the continent. And so outside of conversations about war and famine, for example, or slavery, current curriculum doesn't require us to teach about African people. And so we just completely disregard an entire group of people, their historical views, their stories about Black triumph and livelihood that students never hear about. And it's no wonder why Black humanity is up for debate, because nobody understands or knows or talks about African people, and it's deliberately obscured. And so we need to think about how Africa is exoticized. African people and culture, they're seen as alternative or marginal. Africa is the birthplace of civilization. I mean, it is. So how did this shift to Eurocentric understandings come to be? I mean, I know why. We don't have enough time to talk about why, but do we talk about the fact that natural resources, on African soil, Africa is, home to the 12% of the world's oil reserves. I have tons of stats, but I know we don't have time. 40% of the world's gold and up to 90% of the world's chromium and platinum, according to United Nations. The share of exports from Africa to the rest of the world ranged from 80 to 90% in the last 20 years. And I learned that this summer in my African civilizations course. Still always learning. So we just need to tell the kids the truth about what's happening on the continent and what is happening in real time. That the truth is there, as Rosemia had said, like, what text resources are we using? How are we sort of looking at the materials that we're using within our classrooms? History is really just someone's recollection, right, of events. And so whose recollections are we accessing as fact? What are the depictions and characterizations of Black people that show up in your classrooms? I always felt the responsibility, just to lead to that last part of the question, to preview and really assess the texts and materials that I was using in my classroom, and to help my students to develop critical consciousness as well. I was always in the position of learner. And that really sort of integrative anti-oppression practice should be a core competency of every person that works in education, and it should be passed down in our classrooms. I was offering lunch and learns when I was just figuring out different ways that I could incorporate African history and cultures into all disciplines. I developed an interdisciplinary course very similarly, and I think it was like a social justice course. So teacher training forums, was finding ways, and I also offered learning through community that I was able to do, and I was blessed to be able to do that. But there's always a way. So I encourage those who are resisting to continue. And And I'll leave it to, I have some other ideas to share. I'm not sure if we'll have time, but I'd love to be able to share more about how to incorporate African history into all course disciplines.
Thanks so much, Claudette. You should see me writing down some of these things to make sure that I'd remember, not just for tonight, but to keep them as well for myself. You know, we talk about the sort of deliberate erasure where we glorify rather than having any empathy for African peoples and African diasporic peoples, for the impact of colonialisms, where we continue, in Asante's words, to valorize Europeans and European culture. And so I'm happy that we're having this conversation. We are going to move the question along. We have a second question for Rosemary. Your contribution within the Speak Truth to Power community is transcendent. In your lesson plan for human dignity, you provide an itemized list of moments in time to present historic advancements and setbacks in human rights from a Canadian perspective. Through the lens of equity, how can studying the history of Canadian human rights foster student activism? And how do we equip students to speak truth to power?
Yeah. I'm very honored that I was selected as one of the very first global defenders of human rights in this country as part of the Canadian Teachers Federation, the Robert F. Kennedy Center, and other organizations. That was a great honor. And the category that they put me into, me and my story and some of my efforts, was in terms of human rights. As part of the lesson plan that they created, they took a shortened biography and give students the opportunity to work with that and expand and do other things and compare and contrast. But in terms of what I have done in terms of sorry, the question is about, this is the question about what we have done. I have
and then how can we foster this in students?
Yes, how do we foster it in students? So part of it, of course, was in just having the whole declaration of February is Black History Month, so that even though there was no support within the school, there was this overarching element of support to bring some focus, time, and attention to the experiences, achievements, and contributions of people of African descent in this country. I also worked on various curriculum panels, Canada and World Studies, some history panels with the ministry. I created an Afrocentric resource for the Ministry of Education. But you can create these documents or participate in the creation of these documents, but then of course, what happens to them and how well are they distributed or incorporated, and how comfortable do educators who have yet to do anything in terms of Black history education themselves, how do they then access them or consider accessing them? I've been sort of in many camps, parent of 3 children, educating in a community education and educating at times in a formal institution. And let me just speak for a minute about the non-formal situation. That was another reason why I sought so many other symbolic gestures, because if they're out there, the commemoration of Harriet Tubman, the commemoration of Thornton and Lucy Blackburn, the commemoration of Marianne Shadd Carey, the commemoration of the Black defenders of the War of 1812, the commemoration of the Colored Corps, the commemoration of August 1st as Emancipation Day. These are all moments and reasons to give pause, give attention, to seek out other ways of learning. And finally, the other thing that I've done I've written 7 books on African Canadian history. My first books were about Black women. Why would I do Black women? But as a counter narrative to the usual white men, for those who don't know. And I also wrote the kids' book of Black Canadian history, which I think is a phenomenal resource because it's quick and easy for adults to get into the subject. And it's also quite useful for students. And more recently, I wrote with others. I was the consultant and wrote a number of chapters for Black history, Africa, the Caribbean, and the Americas, which is now being distributed by Delmore Buddy Day Learning Institute. So I've done many different things because many different things needed to be done. And I felt so driven to do as much as I could while I had a public platform in particular to address some of the needs that I knew were there with and without the studies. That's what I've done.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that, Rosemary. I think, and I'll have you know that I have 2 copies of your children's book for Black history. I always kept one in my office at work and one at home. Now both of them are here. Tyler, how do we support Black, Indigenous, and racialized students' agencies within the classroom so that students become anchors of their own histories, lived experiences, and cultural points of reference all year round?
Well, for starters, I'm going to need to get one of those copies of Rosemary's book because I got a little 2-year-old who just consumes these stories. But yeah, like, let me speak to a couple of things. Let's start with like a simple response. If you're an educator, and not just an educator, all of the adults in the building, all the educational stakeholders, do your job, love these kids. It's very simple. Love this kid like it's your own kid, right? Your own kid gives you a hard time. My little one is learning, like she's potty training. It's a frustrating process, but it's a beautiful process, right? Because there's growth within the setbacks. So my first message is just that simple thing that we all know, regardless of where in the world we come from, which is just like, if you're going to work with community, especially kids, love these kids. Treat all these kids, treat every single kid as your own kid, especially Black youth, Indigenous youth, and racialized youth. 2, I guess I would say I'll echo what some of my co-panelists have said. I'm a learner, I'm a lifelong learner, and I don't have all the answers. I'm not a leading educational thinker. There's people on probably watching this who have done and contributed far more than I. But I'm doing my best to curate the ideas of our leading thinkers and of our scholars. And, at 39 years of age, with the better part of 4 decades spent in education, 20 years solely as a student, and then 14 years as a teacher student, and kudos to Friere there, always learning. This has been my life. So, what are some of the ideas, some of the folks that we're drawing from that I think, in terms of our course, and there's going to be, at last count, 43 teachers this year who are co-creating this experience with these young people. So, we've spent time kind of curating ideas. George Day, Afrocentric pedagogy requires a communal approach, not a hierarchical approach, right? So that speaks to the piece that Claudette was talking about, like co-create this thing, right? Go to community. It's not about you dictating for these young people what they're going to experience. It's about working in community and also in community with the students, but also going outside, right? Like in a lot of schools, you know, this course is now being taught in areas that don't have a critical mass of Black, Indigenous, and racialized youth. You know, there's a lot of white kids there. There's in some cases, there's no Black teachers there, right? So you need to go to community. You need to partner with parents, with community stakeholders, organizations who have much to offer in ways of course can go. You know, I'm going to shout out Day again. He talks about the idea that success is both social and academic. Right, so it's imperative that our young people understand that, yeah, okay, there's this academic thing where Eurocentricity dictates that we need to apply a number to like a quantitative measurement to your qualitative experience of education. So like there's that, and yeah, we're stuck in these systems, and the kids want the marks so they can get the scholarships and the grades and go there. Like it's just this vicious thing, but the idea that success is also social success. So kids feeling empowered to speak up for themselves, kids feeling like they've acquired the language and the confidence to step forward and disrupt racism and oppression where they see it. Kids designing their own projects and saying, you know, my grandfather says these racist things, and my final project, I'm going to figure out how to have a conversation with him because everybody in my family just ignores it and pretends like it doesn't happen, right? When you co-create with kids in that way and you build up their critical consciousness all along, amazing things happen. You know, Blacks in Billings, race continues to be significant, right? Like you have people, like think about the time we're in. You got folks who are protesting in Ottawa. You got all these symbols of hate. The kids are taking this all in. You got people saying there's nothing racist going on. Racism doesn't exist. Like, no, all of these kids need to know that race continues to be significant. And conversations about race and racism continue to be muted and marginalized. You know, and these aren't my ideas. Like, this is just, again, going to the scholars, going to our leading thinkers. Elamine, teach young people the language of oppression. Give them that language. I remember being in high school, having these racist things occur to me, not having the language or the knowledge to basically to pin down specifically what was happening. And because I didn't have the language, all I could say was, this isn't fair. You know, but when young people move beyond this idea, like, yes, it's not fair, and here's how it fits into this complex web of systems that serve to marginalize you and make you and erase you and ignore you and make you feel like you can't be confident to be your best self in this world. You know, like this is heavy stuff. One more I'll cite, Javon Johnson, Black Joy, right? You know, the original question in this whole thing talked about, or the lead up said, you know, our history doesn't begin with slavery and capitalism and imperialism, you know, like, so in our course, kids go back well before imperialism and colonization interrupted glorious and complex Black empires and civilizations. And so we can find joy there, and we can find joy all along this whole kind of process of the diaspora, and so on. And so, you know, those are some things. Do no harm. You know, I think it's critical for educators to go into this. Youth have told me, those two youth I spoke to last week, they both said they don't mind if the teacher's not Black, if it's a non-Black educator, but that educator has to be willing to get into the muck, right? Cornel West, he tells us, like, get into the funk of life. Don't be afraid of it, lean into it. And the kids say, like, they're so smart. They say the same thing that this brilliant philosopher is saying, just they want authenticity. They want the teacher, if they're not Black, to come in and say, hey, guess what? I'm not Black. like news bulletin, I'm not Black. And so many of you have more, not only lived experience, but as my friend MPP Laura May Lindo says, lived experience creates lived expertise. So honor that lived expertise that these young people have, right? Let them know that they can bring all of that excellence with them into the classroom. They can bring their full selves into the classroom. They don't have to leave part of their identity at the door. Make that classroom a space that encourages that fulsome and diverse selves. And the kids are also telling me they're so excited to see kids that are not of their community who are also excited to learn this material. They feel seen, they feel respected. Some of the young women are talking about ideals of beauty and a Black boy who had said, oh, I don't date Black girls, I only date white girls. And some of the kids who weren't Black were like, what? Like, it blew their mind. They don't understand internalized racism. So the kids are sitting, listening and learning to one another. And I can go on, but I won't take up any more space.
Well, I heard some gems. Just love the children. Seems really simple, right? And do no harm. I wrote this down. Lived experience creates lived expertise. Thank you so much, Tyler. We are going to go to Claudette, and maybe because I have not been a very good monitor of the time, we want to make sure that we get through these questions, and then we have a few minutes for the question and answer time. Afrocentric perspectives are a collective way of knowing and being. When children see themselves reflected in the curriculum and school leadership, this creates a positive learning experience and community for students. How does Afrocentrism help reclaim discursive and political power within education and beyond? Claudette, can you speak to the importance of including African contemporary and historical content within all subject disciplines? Where have we seen value of Afrocentric approaches to teaching exemplified within student-parent activism that have resulted in policy change?
Let me clear my throat. So yes, I wanted to go back a little bit for this question because I wanted to think about, like, situate myself. How did I get to be where I am? And so it's Black History Month. I want to really thank Rosemary for even putting this Black History Month and centering, like I remember learning from the textbook that you are referring to, that last textbook. So I really am a product, and I'll say this, of the Black Saturday School program. I grew up in Black Saturday School. At the beginning, I was like, Mom, why are we going to school on Saturdays? This is terrible. But I will forever, I thank her all the time for making that a reality for me, because that is where, that's my foundation. Myself and probably 200 other Black children learned together on a Saturday. We learned about African civilizations. We learned about Black Canadian history. So I knew when I was not being told the truth in my regular 5-day, my Monday to Friday school experience. And I want to go back and talk about how all of that Black Saturday School began, because it is Black History Month. I'm thinking about the Black Education Project, Marlene Green, who would have started the Saturday School program years back, well before I was born. The Black Experience Project, the Black Liaison Committee, Black Heritage Program, which I think turned into ACHA, right? CABE, Vernon Farrell, I know, and ACHA was Louis March, I always remember that. Vernon Farrell founded AHEN, and the original Parents of Black Children, which I'll never forget, Karen Braithwaite. So these are people that created that kind of a structure, right? So that there was this stable and very robust learning experience for Black children on a very regular basis. And so although it was only one day of the week, the community that we built there, the parents cooked, we spent all day there. Like that was what solidified me. And so I also, make sure that that's an experience for my own children and for children in our in our communities, because and that would have led to, you know, the development of the Afrocentric alternative school, right? This is where I do want to make sure that children know who they are. We talked in the earlier session or the earlier part of the evening about children knowing the truth. And I learned the truth. And so that helped me to develop a solid foundation upon which I continue to stand. And I see the world through a particular lens. And I always have, on those terms of reference, on who I am as a descendant of Africans. And so that I always say is my superpower. When people ask me, you know, what do you see? That is my superpower, because I want children to see the world through that same Afrocentric lens. So they don't feel like they have to ascribe to or assimilate to a dominant narrative. And they don't have to measure themselves against that Eurocentric measuring stick. And so in that Saturday school experience, I learned, you know, it's interesting to me when people talk about how, you know, Black children can learn math or something like that. But do we know the origins of those mathematical practices that are being used now? That African nations were the birthplace of measurement, right? And calendar charts. The Yoruba people, present day Nigeria now, created their complex counting systems based on unit. Like this is our history. This is who we are. So now to tell the kids, well, I don't know if Black children are really good at math. That's not it. If we tell them where it came from, then it's an entirely different learning experience. And my children are learning, or did learn, their math principles from Mancala and like Awari games, right? So just embracing all of that was life-changing to me. And so I think about those that are still learning, not knocking Shakespeare, but I mean, what happens in a classroom if we don't learn Shakespeare? Like exponential, so many things. Right? So are we centering Black Canadian literature? And how can we really divorce ourselves from these Eurocentric indicators of, you know, and definitions of what is literature and what is history? Because I learned about those things. I learned about Afrofuturism. Learning about art, I was learning about that. Octavia Butler and now Young Yemi, who's one of my favorites, right? That's what our children are learning. So infusing into literally every discipline, there is some way, right, to encourage our children to understand Black and African experiences, cultures, theoretical frameworks. I've even done, as an educator, done some work with physical education staff and talking about what are the ways that in physical education we can talk about sports that are Indigenous to Africa. And so it goes on and on. It's limitless, the possibilities. And so when I talk about that superpower, that's what I intend to pass on to our children. I think it's completely possible. Policy change is incredibly important, and that is going to happen. We continue to push, but until then, you know what I mean? Until then, we fortify our children, we build them up, we tell them about ourselves to sustain us until we get there.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Claudette, for that. You know, it is really so important for us to fortify and to strengthen Black children, not only because of what we know to be the harm that is done to them psychically and emotionally and so on, but it's important for them to know who they are, to know of their legacies, their histories, and their experiences. And, you know, for Bell Hooks talks about education being, you know, a site of freedom for many and having so much possibilities. But for Black children, this is not always the case. And so thank you for that. I'm going to start in reverse order and just go back to Claudette again. I don't know if you have a glass of water you want to take a little bit. But you've mentioned quite a bit of ways of incorporating African-centric history into teaching. Do you want to add any final thoughts? Because that's one of the questions that we got from you, from the audience.
I could go on and on. I have a ton of stories in here. I'm going to share something with you, but it can be incorporated into different course content. And I'm thinking about the Ghana. So Ghana Gadzingwa was a group of Africans who were held captive, and they were putting forward some uprisings, and colonizers had captured these individuals and brought them into the jungle, hoping that animals would kill them and they wouldn't survive. And what they were able to do, I tell the story a lot. My children are probably here like, oh, here she goes. But what they were able to do is they were actually able to create newsletters. And they found paper, they created these newsletters and distributed them outside of where they're being held captive. And then they created some activist playbooks that their counterparts could use outside of that space. And then they escaped their captors. And so when I think about, anytime I feel like I don't know if I can do this, I don't know if I can be strong, like I think about the legacies, when I think about the ancestral gifts that we have been given, that sometimes we don't know about, I want to encourage the classroom educators all the way up to, the classroom educators from every space. I know Rosemary spoke about, people are not always teaching in formal classrooms. Formal, I don't know what that means, but they're always teaching, right? But I think that to as much as we can learn and share, we can do an amazing service to our children by teaching them more about, and I think all children, all adults, regardless of how you're racialized, can learn from those stories. So I think I've touched on quite a few different sort of, discipline or areas of learning where you can incorporate African history. But I think, like I said, it's limitless, literally. And it is going to take a little bit longer. I do recommend, and this is an exercise I've done with our staff, I want to say our staff in our department, was to go through all of our curriculum document, go through that curriculum document, every course that we teach, and ask whose story is not being told here, whose voice is missing, where are we not, like where have we been teaching this from one perspective that we should be shifting that? And we literally went through that with every course. And then, all of these things that we're incorporating, we're not just sort of teaching them out of the blue, we're incorporating things dependent upon that curriculum. And still we can talk about curriculum reform because it's necessary, absolutely. But there are ways that educators can co-create, you said, and as Tyler said, curate, right? What ends up in that classroom and what learning happens in that classroom if you have that lens. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. We often think about these processes as sort of end of the road, and we do not think about them as continuous processes. And so you may see what we call a Eurocentric curriculum, but even that Eurocentric curriculum curates particular things about Europe, because whereas it talks a lot about sort of the great things, it does not talk about genocide. It does not do enough to talk about the ways in which complete communities have been decimated and damaged at the hands of colonialism and so on. So there are particular stories that we're meant to see. And when, as educators, we go through our curriculum documents and we choose to have particular stories continue and perpetuated, we're continuing that process. So thanks for talking about how we can interrupt a lot of those processes, Claudette. Tyler, I have a really long question for you, but I'm going to leave a lot of the description out of it and get right to the question. It describes, and it's still in the question and answer thing. It describes a teacher who's currently teaching the course that you co-developed and wants to know what is the biggest piece of advice that you would give to non-Black educators who are facilitating this or similar courses?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so two things. One I touched on already. First of all, thank you to that educator for engaging in the work, because, simply put, we wrote in the curriculum document, we recognize that there aren't Black educators in every school, but that shouldn't prevent this work, this learning, this education, these philosophies and ideas from being taught. So A, thank you. B, I had a conversation with a couple of my colleagues, my co-creators, who created the course, and one of them who was teaching the course. And she said, even as a Black woman, I still feel this tension about centering Blackness. She's just like, I've just been seeping up this like subtle messages my whole life of like, don't do this. And, kids do too. And they'll challenge me. They'll say, hey, miss, you sound angry, and so, it is okay to center Blackness. And if you're not Black, you probably don't feel that tension of the centering of Blackness, and when I wanted to talk about this in other classes, I'd be like, okay, well, let's talk about patriarchy and then we can get around. Like, I've experienced that myself. So there's that. Lean into, build with community, as Claudette spoke to, and also lean into the discomfort and do that honestly and authentically with the kids. And don't position yourself as the all-knowing educator. Take an Afrocentric approach, build it with them. Hey, we're all learning here, and go to community. If you do those things, if you bring honesty, if you show a willingness to engage in the difficult conversations, and if you have this unshakable knowledge that it is perfectly okay to center Blackness in Afrocentric pedagogies, then the outcome will be great. And it won't be perfect, but nothing in education is perfect. And I'm just thinking how beautiful that is, that it's happening all around the province. And it only happens because our elders, yourself, Fiona, Rosemary, Claudette, other folks behind the scenes, you all
some
have
of
been
us
doing
not
this
so
work.
much elders. Just saying.
Well, I don't listen.
I'm just
I say
teasing you.
elders,
I'm just teasing you.
In age, elders in leaders in Black community that I am in awe of.
Thank you. I'm just teasing you, Tyler.
Yeah, I know.
Rosemary, how can we hold the government or teachers accountable for teaching this content, for adopting an Afrocentric lens, and for teaching this content in affirming ways, not just the degradation of slavery steeped in Eurocentric bias that leave our children feeling less empowered?
Your question almost seems to suggest that we have this perfect curriculum already. I don't even think we do. So I think there have to be a few more writing panels to make sure that curricula gets written, which basically means there has to be a policy decision effected that says this is what we want to see happen. But assuming that has happened, then we have to hold them accountable. And we have to say, this is what we want. This is what we expect. This is what our community deserves. We pay taxes. And make it so. But it has to be many voices. This isn't new. People have been asking for inclusion, asking for equitable education since the 1850s. But now there is a greater critical mass of us. The Black population, since I was successful at having the first Black History Month created, it's doubled in some areas. So now that we have more of us, in positions of importance in government, in education, it's time to really say, we need this to happen now. And I know that you mentioned Laura May Lindo. She's got a bill coming up, if it hasn't happened already, which might help to usher in a few more moves forward. I know that like you, I was on the call earlier, and Oise has set up a Center for Black Studies. I mean, these are all part of the multi-varied package that we have to be shoring up everything so that it will all come together and culminate in this amazing moment when we can go hand in hand, not begging, but demanding to government, this is what we want now, and this is how it should look.
Thank you. I keep coming back to, I don't know why that's where I go to, but we pay taxes, but our children go to school and are taught that they're second-class citizens. So I don't know what that means for our taxes.
They are taught that they're second-class citizens, not necessarily overtly, but through what isn't said, through the lack of representation that is there, through who has the time, who has the assemblies, where the big money goes. Anyway, it's so many nuanced ways. I think that's why it's so hard for some people to appreciate the racism that continues, because it isn't something like it might be in in a stereotypical scene from the Southern United States. It's still happening nevertheless.
Absolutely. Thank you. So we have a final question. We are sort of getting close to the end of the evening. So in a sentence or two, we have a question on Indigenous African spirituality as a part of Black history. And we've talked about sort of the impact of having erasure or deliberate silences or so on Black history. History tells us that African spiritual practices were key to leading us through to our emancipation. How will this aspect, or how might this aspect of our history be reflected in the curriculum? How could we build in ideas of spirituality in the work that we do, given the role that it has played in our emancipation? And we can go in any order for this one.
I'll just offer that I think that one of the ways is by working with things that already exist and people are becoming familiar with. Kwanzaa is an Americanization of many African principles, and those principles, while they are sort of clustered around the December period of time, it isn't that those principles can't be discussed and expanded and worked with throughout the year. And I think that there are other African ways of knowing that are also connected in terms of competitiveness versus individuality versus that we can incorporate in many of the things that we're doing. And there's one other piece, and I think that it came up earlier today too, just the connection between and among African ways of knowing and First Nations ways of knowing. Many people on Turtle Island have a connection to First Nations communities and or First Nations communities, Indigenous communities in other parts of the world that we should not overlook.
Thank you, Rosemary.
I'm just gonna say, like, I can't answer that question, and I think, and I have this tension with that, and it makes me want to know more. I'm a product of a system and of a culture and of an experience where much of that has been robbed from me. So to Rosemary's point, there is this connection between Indigenous spirituality and knowledge systems and African spiritualities and ways of knowing, and it's something that I'm interested to learn more about. So I would invite that person, hey, get in touch, You know, I can be found easily. We are going to be, you know, I took a necessary break, but we are going to continue to mobilize and we're going to continue to push. And so, you know, all hands on deck.
Thank you for that response, Tyler. Any thoughts on that, Claudette?
Yeah, you know, it got me to thinking about years ago teaching or having world religions is one of the courses that's taught in the social science humanities department, or our department anyway, and the characterizations of African Indigenous spiritualities being characterized as kind of demonic or barbaric, or, you know, really mischaracterized is the best word that I can say. And I think it's important that if we don't know, we should ask, as Tyler mentioned. Like, I think there's also, you're right, I think that most people may not necessarily be connected or aware of different spiritualities, ways of knowing, ways of worship and understanding from their African backgrounds. So it is really important to do that research to find the right person that can answer those questions, but also to be very careful as we're teaching, you know, courses around different religions, to ensure that, you know, that the stories are being told not from a Eurocentric standpoint, but to make sure that there's a breadth of knowledge that's shared, you know, that is holistic and that offers the right and offers that learning from the right place. And I guess that's what I would say. I know that it's difficult to, I think, to find resources, but I would encourage people, well, not difficult, let me not say that. It may not necessarily be readily available to every educator to find those resources, but it means maybe doing a little extra work to search it out. And to investigate. I think I love the idea that Tyler had mentioned around investigating alongside our students in the classroom and being honest about not knowing everything, because isn't that a relief? I remember the first time someone said, Claudette, you don't have to know everything. I said, I don't. And so it was great to just be able to be a co-learner, right? And a co-thinker, and to create inquiry questions along with our students to learn more. So yeah, I don't have a deep knowledge on those areas, but again, my learning continues.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Claudette, for that response. Mm-hmm. As we wrap up, please join me in thanking our esteemed panelists, Rosemary, Claudette, and Tyler. It was really great talking to you today, and I could listen to any of you or all of you for whole periods of time. I love when I'm listening to folks and I feel like I'm learning something new. It's actually quite incredible. You've kindly joined us to speak of approaches to history, where we can learn about Africa, about African epistemologies, and offer some fulsome and critical links between African diasporic peoples and contemporary African cultures and life. We've talked a little bit about how we can connect African Black and other learners to the past, to the present, and the future, of approaching African and Black history in terms of the relation to history, to context, to identities and politics, of placing Black and African experiences at the center of what we do, the center of analysis, and as a prism to understanding global events, including how we interrogate historical narratives, including colonial historical narratives. Thank you again for talking to us and for possibly giving us an additional topic that we can talk to at CIARS, you know, African spirituality and so on. To our guests, we also want to say thank you, not just to the panelists, but to CIARS volunteers and members who have participated tonight. Thank you to Professor George Day for helping to keep this space, and for having us as a community to talk about these matters. Thank you to CIARS volunteers, Alicia, I can't say your last name, and I wish I'd practiced it. Alicia, Mary Carmen, Ayan, Grace, Sifa, Talha, Rukia, Tony, Karine, and Sarah. Thank you so much for all that you've done. The recording will be uploaded to YouTube and available for review in the upcoming days. Thank you so much to everyone.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, and great job, Fiona.
Thanks, Tyler.
Great job. And thank you to my fellow panelists. I always enjoy learning from other people as well. And I really did tonight. And thank you to everybody who was part of this. It was great.
Yeah, it's beautiful. It's beautiful to hear from our elders. So, you know, I appreciate all the work that you've done.
Tyler, it's all good.
Oh, Tyler, I think you're killing Claudette here.
Never talk about age. That's just one more ism we don't need to deal with.
I'm ready. I'll take that. But yes.
Claudette knows. Claudette knows. Claudette leads in so many different places and spaces, and it's like she's like a big sister of mine. Although, like
big sister. Oh, here, you too, huh? How many times did you talk about how old you were tonight, Tyler?
Anyway,
Anyway,
tells me that he's particularly young.
Love you.
It is really great to work with each of you. So it really has been my honor.
You did a great job, Fiona. That timing, you did really well. I appreciate it. There was a lot of people online, and thank you to the whole team, because I know putting this together it's a lot of work and coordinating, and the questions are great.
Yeah, and there's like 26 questions there. So is